Guys, if you're anything like me, looking at maps has always been a huge part of my preparation and execution for my outdoor adventures. I have been using GoHunt digital maps on desktop and mobile for quite some time now. I have used these maps for years for my in-depth e-scouting tactics and my methods of using offline maps during the hunt. Well, now I'm happy to report GoHunt Maps now covers all 50 states. There's two ways to get the GoHunt map. You can sign up for a GoHunt Insider membership and get the benefits of all the draw odds, harvest statistics, unit breakdowns, strategy articles, as well as access to the 50 state maps, plus savings on gear for being an Insider member. Like right now, they're doing double points. For an Insider membership, sign up now at GoHunt.com, use the JScott promo code, and get a $50 GoHunt Gear Shop gift card just for signing up. You can also just sign up for a GoHunt Explorer membership, and that gives you access to 50 states for $50. Use the JScott promo code. Guys, also don't forget to get a 10% discount on gear at the GoHunt Gear Shop by using the JScott promo code. You can also reach out to my friend Cody Nelson of 20 plus years, either by phone or by text. 602-399-3699. Make sure you tell him I sent you. I want to thank GoHunt.com for their loyal sponsorship of my podcast. We're over 815 episodes in, and they've been with me since the beginning. I also want to thank Kuiu Ultralight Hunting for their sponsorship of this podcast. They provide the gear that I use on all of my hunting adventures. You can go to the Kuiu website directly, kuiu.com, order directly. They're a direct-to-consumer company. They make the best gear in the hunting industry, and I've been a loyal supporter of theirs for years. Also, phonescope.com. Go to phonescope.com, use the JScott or JScott22 promo code, and you're going to get a 10% discount at Phonescope. Guys, thanks for listening to the podcast. Thanks for supporting me. If you have any questions or you'd like to send me a comment, the best way to do that is on my Instagram account at JScottOutdoors. Again, let's get right to this episode, and thanks for your support.
Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. This is your guest host again, Cliff Gray. Today I have Jake Muise on the podcast. Jake is the CEO and founder of Maui Nui Venison. Jake has a long history of hunting axis deer on the Hawaiian Islands. He has also been involved in several projects managing invasive ungulates across Hawaii. We're going to talk about hunting in Hawaii in a general sense, but we are also going to specifically go into a deep dive on axis deer hunting, and we're going to dive even deeper into Jake's business. I'm really intrigued by it. All right, Jake, let the listeners know anything important I missed, but also I purposely skipped an introduction of your company because I want you to do that intro. The concept is absolutely fascinating to me. Go for it.
Thanks, Cliff. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk story. As you mentioned, been in Hawaii now for 22 years, came out here from northern Alberta. And just fascinated with axis deer. And a long story short, there was ended up creating a business, and we think of it more as a solution. But that's called Maui Nui Venison, and our mission is to help balance axis deer populations on Maui for the betterment of our ecosystems, communities, and food systems. So, been obsessed with axis deer for basically 20 years. I hunt a few other animals every once in a while. I get to just got back from Colorado a little while ago, but
okay,
they're it, man. That's it's all I think about day and night. So excited to give you guys some more details for sure.
Yeah. So your original exposure to axis deer was just recreational hunting. Is that correct?
Yeah. So came from, basically northern Alberta, grew up eating moose meat, showed up here in Hawaii to play Division I volleyball for the University of Hawaii, and then got stuck with a roommate from Molokai, which is this small island off of Oahu, and had no idea the amount of fish and game that were here from a recreational standpoint, and obviously grew up doing that. So was immediately kind of adopted into that family and that environment, and found kind of a home away from home really fast. And axis deer they were an incredible, they're extremely difficult to hunt. So they're really challenging, and they're a lot of fun, and they're just an amazing resource to be able to bring venison back, to your dorm room every second or third weekend, because we were all broke and we
Sure.
having some extra deer meat in the freezer was always a good thing.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And you're not the first individual that's told me how difficult they are to hunt. I have a bunch of, very proficient bow hunter friends, and they all say like, they went there and they're like, yeah, it's difficult, man. They're and why is that, Jake? Like from your perspective?
I think a couple things. One, from an evolutionary standpoint, you grow up with tigers and leopards around.
Sure.
And not only that, but you grow up with tigers and leopards in like really dense, brushy areas. So although like at night, they'll prefer a lot of the open range, they actually like really prefer these dense areas. And so in India and here in Hawaii, they'll find like partner mammals. Like in India, I think those were langur monkeys, and here they use minor birds. Like they're so smart that they're teaming up with other animals to help like pay attention for them.
Sure.
And I think there's just like, those are two animals that are already probably some of the top predators in the world, in these dense areas, in there being like, a tiger and a leopard that could be in the trees above you. I think you evolve with those things around, you're already like really switched on for a bunch of different reasons. And then they just have like incredible eyesight. They smell really well. They just have all of it. Like they have the trifecta of those things that just make them really, really tough to get around. And then the other part of it here, specifically in Hawaii, is they have an abundance of food. So when you look at their grazing patterns on a daily basis, like they sit, like they're not really bedding. They're kind of bedding and feeding, and they're constantly chewing that cud. Like they have an abundance of food. They can stop at any time they want. There isn't this, like, you can tell when they're moving around, there isn't this sense of urgency to eat at all times. So they're just so they have this constant food source, and they really can, like, when they're concerned about something, you can tell, like, they stop, and they stop for like a long time. Like my favorite thing is when somebody new comes, one of my buddies comes and they hunt, and like a doe busts us and she starts staring us down, and they're like, okay, we'll just wait. And I'm like, oh no, we're done. Like, she's not, like, we're in this for like 45 minutes. If you want to like try and stick this thing out, like we can go over here and try and find something else. Like she's not giving up. Like she's not going back to eating anytime soon. And they're just like, what? I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is
yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
And I have a tag along question to that, man, because I think you probably have a unique ability to answer it. Because my understanding, listening to you on other podcasts, is you've hunted, probably heavily hunted axis deer, and then in your business, you're putting your own pressure on the deer as you guys harvest them.
Yeah.
Do you notice? And I guess I'll give you a little background on this. In my years of elk hunting, I noticed a huge, like the difference between a heavily pressured elk versus one that's on a private ranch that only gets hunted 4 or 5 days a year. It's literally like a different species. You know what I mean, Jake? Like it to compare the two is not fair, but I know other species are different. What do you find in that regard with axis deer? Are they just naturally really keen, or does hunting pressure, come into play?
No, so you nailed it. I think axis deer start at a different level as most other animals. And then on top of that, I think they're probably one of the most intelligent animals like I've ever hunted, and had an opportunity to hunt a lot of different ones. When you start educating them, they just get smarter and smarter and smarter. So we are specifically pressuring areas to move their home ranges so that there's more feed for cattle ranchers or farmers or whatever that looks like. But we give you a great example. We use FLIR drones every single night. So we have a drone 1,000 feet in the air watching what we're doing, and deer that are already educated to what we're doing, they can hear our UTV a mile and a half away, and in the dark, they'll start moving off of the roads, which is primarily where we like harvest off of. Sure. And they'll just move to an area that can't be seen from the roads, and they just sit there and wait. Yeah. Like they're so smart. And so I think like that exact same thing translates to elk. Like when I think these animals like educate themselves really well, and that's just a function of pressure. And so the more pressure you put on them and the more like negative conditioning that like, they're like, oh wait, that's like, I recognize what that sound is. I recognize what's going on here. Like, this isn't safe. They just get smarter and smarter. And that's why, you know, those really old ones are hard to find. Those really old ones, like that's the exact reason is they start like recognizing that conditioning and then they don't move there. So 100%. So we use that to our advantage. We use the understanding of that behavior to our advantage here to help like serve community better.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have to, you know, from a practical aspect, just model that into how you're harvesting animals. And I could probably dig crazy deep into that, but it's interesting to me, Jake, because over the years, you know, I guided primarily mule deer and elk hunts. And I always feel like when I've described the dynamic that you just mentioned, like, hey, they do learn over time. You know, they know when we put a camp in this area, the whole dynamic changes.
Oh yeah.
I was doing a bunch of backcountry stuff. So, but I noticed that if we go put in wall tents, it's like the first night you start a fire, the dynamic changes a little bit, you know, just little things like that. And I always feel like when I've said that to people, they partially believe it. You know what I mean? But what's cool about what you just said is you actually have the evidence of it in your business.
Well, I'll give you a really specific example that's actually a little bit scary. Is our early on in the maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, we used spotlights, which is legal here to do so at night with a permit.
Okay. Sure.
As we were working in these particular areas, we had a couple projects, and as you're getting to the end of this project, and it was a closed area of 800 acres, and we had negatively conditioned these deer a bunch of times, like bumped into them, weren't able to shoot them because we have to harvest, so we have to like render every single one in the head. It has to be shot in the head. Yeah. And 4 of these deer figured out if they like started moving their head around. Like they were moving their head, I think, originally to like move away from the light.
Yeah.
And the last entire month that we were chasing these 4 deer, when the light went on them, they literally would like start bobbing their head up and down. Like they'd be moving, like it'd be like they're moving them like rhythmic side. It's like they learned that specific behavior was keeping them safe. And that's not a behavior that like they, for any evolutionary reason, would have like developed. Like they developed based on the conditioning we provided them.
Yeah.
So they are like, they're crazy smart. And I think all animals given enough conditioning, like will start completely changing behavior. So like wall tent and fire, they're like, yeah, this is not a great idea. Let's get out of here.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you say, it's like they're just reacting to, I mean, you call it intelligence and I call it that too, but I don't know the right word. You know what I mean, Jake? Because to me, it's more just like they're reacting to the stimuli. And once it only takes a few times and they realize like, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. You know, it's kind of, it's pretty interesting in that regard. And, you know, let's just hit on that right now, Jake, because I'm sure a lot of the listeners would want to kind of get some context around this conversation before we get deep into your business. If somebody were, you know, they were wanting to come out and hunt axis deer in Hawaii, do you have thoughts on, you know, when the best time to come is? I'm very naive to them, Jake. I haven't hunted them. I mean, I don't even know when they shed their velvet, you know, when they have antlers. Can you hit all that stuff real quick, just so people kind of get a little information on that side of things?
Yeah. So the kind of pronounced rut period is typically like April through June, and it's not really pronounced. And one of the reasons it's not pronounced is axis deer are one of the few deer that their sperm is viable year round. So after they cast those antlers, they're still able to breed every single doe, which isn't the case for most other deer species, right? Right. And so what ends up happening is through the years, there's been these like cyclical changes where there's a bunch of bucks that are like in off season. So there'll be a bunch of bucks that are hard while other ones are developing velvet. So you can actually find them all over the place. So because all of like those bucks aren't essentially like rutting at the same time as like deer or as those are going into estrus, there isn't really this pronounced period. So it's pretty cool. Like from April, May through like June, July, you can find like bucks roaring and it getting like pretty exciting there for those couple of months. So that's typically the best time. But I think one of the things that are most exciting for somebody from the continent that wants to come here and hunt is you can do it year round, right?
Sure.
So there's no bag limits here. There's no seasons here. I mean, you can go online, get your hunting license for $100, and you can essentially come anytime, shoot as many deer as you want. And so I think most of the people that like we end up like inviting, although like certainly they want to come during the rut, most of them end up in like here in like January and February when it's cold as hell wherever they are.
Yeah, it's the off season, and it's
it's an off season, and they have to come. Like one guy described it as like flushing a bunch of birds every single day. Like there's just so many deer. There's just like so many opportunities. You get like a lifetime worth of hunting in, like 4 or 5 days while you're here. So there's some really good, there's some good public lands on, some on Maui. Lanai is really the place that they have really good established game management areas with the state. They have hunts basically year round in a bunch of different areas. You can pull tags. There's some great outfitters over there. So you can you're really going to enjoy it if you come year round, especially if you can bring your wife and kids at the same time.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
Leave them at the beach for half the day and you can go half the day in the morning or something. But if you're coming to find, if you're coming to chase a big buck, you're coming in, kind of May through that June, July period.
Yeah, I got you. And I think you hit on something that to me is very intriguing. I think a lot of listeners, it will be too. And that's, a lot of the hunts here in the 48 states that we do, you don't have a lot of opportunity. If you're an over the counter elk hunting unit or something like that during archery season, you might have one opportunity, maybe 2 opportunities to shoot your bow. And the downside of that for sure is that you just don't get exposed to that part of the skill set. You know what I mean, Jake? I noticed that individuals that, let's say, to me, an opportunity target rich environment that's closer to all of us is Texas, right? Here in the 48 states. I noticed a lot of people who hunt Texas, that component of their hunting skill set, particularly bow hunters, they're just better at it because they get exposure. They get a bunch of exposure. And I view it as, that's kind of one of the reasons I would love to come there is just can I go there, 10 days, access deer hunting? I don't need to, I'm not after the biggest deer ever. I just want a bunch of opportunities to stalk, to shoot my bow. Am I kind of on the right track in terms of that? It's that kind of opportunity.
Yeah. The probably the most value you get out of coming here is the repetitions of mistakes you make in stalking.
Yeah, sure.
So when buddies asked, they're like, hey, what should I bring in everything? I was like, bring 24 arrows. And they're like, what? I'm only going for one. I'm like, bring 24 arrows.
Yeah.
Because they're going to jump 20 of those for sure. And it typically takes somebody that hasn't worked with axis deer for a while. They can get lucky if we sit them down and it's the perfect morning. But if we're spot and stock, they're 10 to 15 tries in before they're even drawing their bow. Because it's really awesome to go with them and be able to say oh, you knocked that arrow too fast. Or when you moved around that corner, you just moved a little, all of the repetition that comes with being really great at stalking is the biggest benefit because they're just constantly busting you. And if you think about it and you even take some notes down, you'll find out really quickly, oh, I need to move a lot slower or that wind wasn't perfect. But you then, as soon as you're done and you're damn it, you're oh, there's more deer right there. So you get to go do it again and again and again.
Yeah, you get to iterate on it, which I think, if anybody's, and I know you have a history as an athlete, Jake, but if anybody's into any skill set, athletics or anything, being able to iterate real quickly in hunting, it's so, you don't get the opportunity. The vast majority of hunting, you don't get to iterate like that. And I've actually over my, even all the exposure I would get in the Western states still, you're talking about probably on one hunt, a guy's getting the number of stocks he gets in maybe 5 years of hunting. So it's huge. And then plus, like you say, like he gets to immediately think about what went wrong.
Yeah, I've done 2 years of like high country mule deer in Colorado. And
okay.
My first year I went with like a couple of buddies that are like arguably really good at it. They've had a lot of success. And the first year, like, finally found a nice one, and I'm like, let's go. And they're like, what are you talking about? Or like, this is gonna take us 2 days. I'm like, what are you talking about? Let's go right now. And they're like, no, like that's not how this is done here. Like if you blow that, like we're done. That guy's going up and over, and we're never gonna see him again. So it's been this awesome lesson for me because I've learned to be so aggressive as a hunter here.
Sure.
Like going through mule deer and then being like, no, wait. Like we're not going anywhere. You're going to sit in glass for the next 2 days. So I know how it feels.
Yeah. Well, that's like Western hunter. I think as people get proficient at it, they do exactly what you're saying. They learn how to take the risk out of the situations. And part of that is probably because they're not quite, I'm probably not near as proficient as you are at stalking deer because you've gotten so much practice at it. Yeah. But the other thing is, it's just the risk of it getting blown is like, it's like season devastating, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So different styles develop out of that. Before we jump off of just hunting opportunities in Hawaii, what other opportunities are there, Jake? I see guys with goats, sheep, that stuff. Is that as readily available as axis deer hunting? What are your thoughts on those opportunities?
Yeah, so across Hawaii, there's goats, sheep. There's both purebred mouflon and hybrid sheep and feral sheep. Obviously, there's pigs all over the place. Kauai, which is a really interesting story that ties into blacktail or that ties into axis deer, is Kauai, which is a small island within like the northern side of Hawaii. Like Kauai got blacktail introduced the same time Maui got axis deer introduced. So in the late 60s, early 70s. You can still barely find a blacktail on Kauai. Like they're in these crazy, think of like those dense BC areas and all, like they're in like the densest forest of Kauai, and they're like mythical creatures like nobody ever sees them. But it's a great comparison to say like blacktail went to Kauai and axis deer went to Maui at essentially the exact same time, and there's 70,000 deer on Maui, and you can hardly find them on Kauai, and that's the real difference between them being able to breed year round. So just a side.
I got you.
Yeah. So blacktail on Kauai, goats essentially almost every single island. Lots of public hunting areas, but like any place, like kind of need to reach out to somebody like to get some pointers on like where to go and a bunch of different things. But essentially every island has hunting every day where you can pick up your bow and go for sure.
Yeah, go hunting. It's interesting, man. You hit on something that I wanted to talk about in this conversation, and that's that I don't think hunters realize like your situation in Hawaii with the the non-native and invasive species, however you want to categorize them. It's actually, people don't realize in the western states like Colorado, a lot of the species that we hunt, they're native species to certain areas in the 48 states, but not necessarily where they're at now. So and as we dive into this, I think you'll see, Jake, I'm very interested in that whole conversation. I even mountain goats in Colorado, a lot of people don't realize that technically that's an invasive species. Yeah. And so, not to get off on a tangent, but there's really only proof that they naturally were in, down to like the northern part of Idaho. They were transplanted into most areas they are in Colorado. And then the reality is genetically, the vast majority of elk in Colorado they're transplants. From whenever we, all the settlement of the West and all of that, brought all those species down, all the market hunting. Well, they came back from transplants from other places. And the reason I get off on that tangent is, it's interesting to me, the mentality of introducing these species, in the last 100 years, 50, 60, 70 years ago, it wasn't abnormal, I mean, and even before in Hawaii, but they did that in New Mexico. They introduced a bunch of different oryxes. They introduced the ibex, all these different things. But the point I was going to make is it relates to the blacktail is it's amazing to me that some of them do just awesome and some of them peter out. You know what I mean? They do too awesome. Some of them, in the end, and then others vanish. I find this super intriguing when we talk about game animals. Like, it sounds like to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, but axis deer, I mean, they must be pretty adaptable, right?
Oh,
Jake, is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. They're and you're right. Maybe intelligence is the wrong word. Adaptable is maybe a much greater word. They're able to adjust a home range from like 1.5 miles to 10 acres, depending on like pressure and feed and water. We did a project on the Big Island, which doesn't have any axis deer on it right now, but 4 axis deer were illegally introduced to the Big Island, which is, 1 million plus acres. The area of introduction was like 100,000 square miles. And
yeah, I heard a rumor you killed them.
We did, yeah. But there was basically, it was a 3-year hunt, and it was almost like a 3-year backpack hunt. Like, sure. Where they were located, basically it took us 7 months to find any sign of them because we had to cover such a huge area. And this will come back to the adaptable side of it. Is the reason it took so long is they found this really interesting lava tube that was collecting water, had a water trough at the end, had the right feed profile, was like just far enough away from like different sets of pressure and stuff. Sure. And when we originally found them before we like bumped their home range, they had been in less than like a 40-acre area for over a year.
Yeah.
Which you think is highly unnatural for a deer species to like not want to roam and like have like a given home range.
Right.
So extremely adaptable, and probably one of the reasons like they've proliferated the way that they have is I think they're able to go find these little safe cubby holes that they can be in there for a long time and grow until like the density becomes so uncomfortable that they basically have to move to the next area, right?
Right. And in that story, I on the Atia podcast, that's a great story. You get in depth, and I think listeners should go listen to it. So we don't need to totally go through the whole thing, but it's a really cool story, Jake. And it brings up, when I heard this story the first time, it brought up a thought to me. So somebody actually brought the deer from one of the other islands. I'm assuming secretly to the Big Island.
They flew them over by helicopter. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So it's obvious to me, and this is very prevalent with a lot of the exotics in different parts of the states. There's always this like tension, right? Because there's a certain part of the the biological community that doesn't want any invasives. And then there's a contingent of people that really enjoy hunting them. And I think me and you are probably included in that. But it's this huge spectrum. Like, some people are like, I don't care what the invasive is affecting. I want as much abundance of that invasive species as possible because I really love hunting them. And then at the very other end of the spectrum, there's people that say they need to be, totally just wiped off, right?
Yeah.
And I personally, your business is around, is like encompassing, trying to find the balance in that. And I just want to hear your thoughts, Jake. How do you justify where you're at on that scale and where your business is at on that scale?
Yeah, we think of it from like it's a really good question, and balance is not like an easy answer. It's like a very loaded word. And so what we try and do is like, what is two things. One, we're constantly thinking about what is best for our communities. So we're the most isolated landmass on the planet. We import like 90% of our food. So the idea of having a constant nutrient dense food source in deer like makes a lot of sense. But the other side of that, like you've said, is like we are also the endangered species capital of the world. Like every species has a right to exist in its own place, and access deer impact that. So what we try and think through is like, where do these deer belong? And we believe they belong within our food system. And if you think of like Hawaii as mountain to ocean or Mauka to Makai, all of our mountain areas are these like critical ecological areas that house all of our endangered species, collects all of our water. Guess what? If we run out of water, we're in a lot of trouble. But as you come down slope to the places where we create food, those are kind of the areas that we think through, like, these would be great places to have like long-term sustainable populations of deer where they're most accessible to hunters, in that like they're in these mid-elevation ranges, and they're a net positive to food systems. So it's this constant balance for us. But ultimately, we get to provide the tool for it, but in the end, we don't really decide. So we provide a service to large landowners. We don't operate on public lands. It's illegal for us to operate on public lands, just like anywhere else. But what we're able to do through like those, we do highly accurate surveys with forward-looking infrared. I mean, we have a lot to learn in everything we do, but if there's one thing that like I don't mind speaking confidently to, it's our surveys. We developed that with that project on the Big Island to try and like find them. But we basically have the best forward-looking infrared in the world. And we do these surveys out of helicopter that give us like extreme confidence in the total number of deer. And the reason I mention that is we go to the like that large landowner or manager and say, you have 6,000 deer. How many do you want? So they're making the decision of balance, because as an invasive species in Hawaii, the burden of those deer and their relative resource fall to the landowner. They're not managed by the state. So it's up to the private landowner to decide what to do with them. We provide them with highly accurate data, and then we say, like, we give them the tool that says like, okay, if you want it to be 2,000 instead of 6,000, like we can do that for you. Like that's what the tool is. But collectively, like our communities have to decide what long-term balance looks like. And what's awesome is all of our like the vast majority of our community here, it's not split. Like the vast majority of the community on Maui is saying we want a long-term balanced population. Nobody's really pushing for eradication. And even our hunting communities are saying like there's too much.
Yeah, sure.
You're seeing, especially when our hunters see on some of our other islands, Maui's population is still growing. But on Lanai and Molokai, those populations have basically grown to their, well, not their max capacity, but they're basically, population is only going up and down there with available feed. So we're getting these big die-offs. So last year, we had thousands and thousands of deer essentially just die of malnutrition on Molokai and Lanai, these two other islands that we don't work on at the moment. And for our hunting community, you imagine like, that's a continual resource for you, and you go out to like utilize that resource, and you can't, like they're dying, they're malnourished, like you can't even utilize that resource. It's so out of balance. So I think even our hunting community is saying like, yeah, less deer means healthier deer for everybody. So collectively, I think our communities here, especially on Maui, have decided like, yeah, there's got to be a balance here. They can't just keep going the way that it's going.
Yeah. And I could see, I, over the years, I've been around hunters and myself, when you observe an animal that's unhealthy or doing poorly, for hunters in particular, and tell me your opinion on it, Jake, but I think it's really striking to hunters because they know, like they're used to hunting a really healthy animal. They know what a healthy one looks like. So when they observe one that's struggling, it's much more, I don't know if it's just they recognize the relative difference, but it's very striking to me. If I see like a sick animal, it's like it kind of makes your stomach roll. Where somebody who doesn't hunt, I don't even think they really notice. Whereas a hunter can, you can drive past a field, right, and there's a whitetail out there doing poorly, and generally a hunter will know immediately, like something's wrong with that deer. So I'm sure that's the case, man, where you're saying these animals are doing poorly. Hunters observe it and they're not fans,
Yeah. And ultimately, I think that's where a lot of support for finding balance comes from as well. Like ultimately, it was my initial trigger point. What was like probably 20 or 18 years ago was the first time I saw like a die off. Like it came around the corner, like we were walking, came around the corner to our regular spot, and there was like 20 or 30 deer, and they weren't dead yet, but they were laying and they couldn't move. They were so malnourished. And I was just like you're just like, what?
Yeah, what's going on?
Like, and it was and that was a trigger for me to be like, wait, like we gotta do something. There has to be something to do. Like, so yeah, completely. And then vice versa. Hunters are the first person that are able to see, and you've seen this, like when you just see like an extremely healthy animal, like you see that bull or that animal that you're just like, whoa.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So yeah, our hunting community our recreational hunting community plays a major role in long-term balance here on Maui for sure.
Yeah, and it sounds like to me, you make an effort to get. I know that you're doing it on private land, and there's obviously just kind of a division there where you're not like stepping on subsistence / public land hunters or however you classify them in Hawaii. But it sounds like you do an effort. You're making an effort, Jake, to not that be an issue. I've been around game management programs here in the US where that's always an issue. You know what I mean? If here with elk, it's about cow elk, right? People want opportunities for their kids to hunt cow elk late in the season, but that's always a rift. There's always these things. And that's the most interesting part of your business, I think, or one of the more interesting parts is I just know from my minimal exposure to it that you've had to deal with a lot of regulatory stuff that people probably don't understand, or they don't have a really good grip on. And just give me an idea of what those challenges have been. I mean, hit on the USDA thing, hit on working with ranchers. More than anything, Jake, I'm just curious because I know that those are like very difficult things to do.
Yeah. It took a long time. It took about like 7 years to essentially jump through all the different hurdles to be able to harvest like a wild invasive animal here in Hawaii under USDA inspection so that like that animal can be sold. And basically like where it starts is the USDA FSIS Food Safety Inspection Services has this giant like book that you'd imagine all of our government agencies have have like a million rules in it. And they are unwilling to change those rules. That's like the Federal Meat Inspection Act. That's what operates like across the country. And so we had to figure out within that giant book how to meet all of the rules and expectations, but in the field. And luckily, there was a guy here in Sumner Erdman in the 70s that laid some of the initial groundwork to get like a few things changed. But basically, we have to follow every single rule you would see in like a typical brick and mortar slaughter facility. So the inspectors have to be able to view that animal, tell that it's healthy, like that process of like transporting the animal and everything has to be humane, which we get to skip obviously because it's wild. But the toughest thing is the terminology is rendering, but you have to render that animal. You have to shoot that animal in the head the same way a slaughter facility would at the same proficiency as a cow that goes into a chute, gets a head clamp, and you can stand right there and shoot it in the head. So that's like, it's taken a long time to develop the harvesting system that allows us to do that. But then there's mobile slaughter units and food safety plans and insurance and like all these things that come along with you producing like a food product for human consumption and sale that have just taken a long time to figure out like, okay, how do we make sure, seems like a small thing, but like, how do we make sure in a 3-hour period, we can go find deer, harvest them, bleed them, transport them back to our mobile slaughter facility, get them completely processed clean and not have a single hair on it.
Yeah. And go for it. Go. Well, Jake, like you left me with so many questions, Jake, and I think I have a little I've been in USDA like beef processing facilities, And so I don't think most listeners will understand that we all view game meat that we harvest. We view it as very clean source of protein. We put it in high regard. But tell me if I'm wrong, Jake, but I think 99% of the meat that we put in our freezer as hunters would not pass. Like it wouldn't get through the process. Like one hair, any sort of fluid, all that stuff. Like you're talking about a very sanitary environment. Go ahead.
I can say 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's not only that, it's like all of the small nuance to like sanitize your knife between touching your scabbard and the animal, and certain rinse down or like procedures for like when guts or offal come out. Like so we had to. What's interesting is we took all of our hunting experience and all of the things that go wrong when you try and debone an animal on the ground, and we designed like this really unique mobile slaughter system so that we minimize the number of times we were essentially like touching an animal. So
sure.
It went from, I think our first week or so using our mobile slaughter unit, it took us about like 20 minutes a deer, and now we do a deer in under a minute. Like under a minute, it's clean without a hair on it.
Yeah. So gutted and skinned in under a minute. That's amazing, man.
And it's not just like, ultimately we created the system, but then you have to get all these amazing team members to come on board and get them like highly, highly trained. Because if you mess up any of that, the USDA is like, oh, here's a write-up. Oh, you're done for the day. Like there's all this like risk that goes along.
So it's not like that individual animal has to be shucked or used in a different way. It's like you're done for the day until you fix the process.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
I got you.
There's it took us a long time to get to the point where there wasn't like continual risk every single day of the USDA being like, this isn't good enough. This isn't good enough. This isn't good enough. But the learning lesson was over the 7 years is every time they said like it wasn't good enough, it was, well, what's this, like, how do we solve that? So it's just constant problem solving for like, there wasn't like a one solution on day one. Like last week we changed something to get even better.
Right.
So it's just this constant evolution of like, how do you go harvest a wild animal in the field and basically in 45 minutes have it back cleaned, like not a single hair on it under inspection. So we've got like, our guys, we think of our guys as like, there's very specific guys that shoot, but they're actually the least like not useful, but like our drivers have to be able to average at night. So we do all of our harvesting at night. We basically have rally car drivers.
Yeah.
So like we train our guys when we bring guys on, everything's at night. You can't see anything. Like we make them go run the roads during the day so they know where every rock is and everything else. Because if they don't average like 15 to 25 miles off road, which is pretty fast.
Yeah, sure.
Like they won't get deer back to the unit fast enough to clean them.
Oh, I got you.
So like, and then we call them like our CrossFit athletes, but like we can't physically drag any single deer. So if our shooter shoots something at like 180 yards, we basically have guys sprinting in the dark to pick up a 200-pound deer, throw on their back and like sprint it back. Because the 7 minutes, if it can be 5 minutes instead of 9 minutes, that's all time we get back because we only have a 3-hour window to make everything happen every single night. So like, it's just this incredible team of guys that each play like a very specific role. And each one of the small nuances of each one of their positions equates to getting enough deer back every night to actually have an impact on ecosystems and communities, and keep like that solution working on a nightly basis.
Yeah. And keeps your business going. And it's crazy to think about that. I mean, and this is just my thought on it. My thought on it, Jake, is like, wow, probably a lot of these regulations are just egregious, but that doesn't matter because you have to comply because and I should have mentioned this in the introduction. You sell this Axis deer meat on your website, right? So anybody can buy it. So it goes into the food system. So it has to comply with this. But it's just amazing. And you said it a couple times because I think in your voice I could tell like that is a quite of a accomplishment, and that's not a single hair on the meat. Like that's like try to go look at like a hunter's quarters and like find somebody that doesn't have a single hair on the, you know what I mean? Like there's you probably, it'd be hard to get under probably 50 or under 100 hairs. You know what I mean? So no, I hear you. It's this process you guys have to go through, which is pretty amazing. To be honest, and it's one of the reasons the business is so intriguing to me is I didn't even really think it was possible. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways. I know that I know there's probably maybe the closest analogy on Earth is they do some of this in New Zealand. Is that right, Jake? So have you? Well, I'm gonna circle back to that because I have one question in that discussion that I want to hit on before we jump into that. But so keep that New Zealand point in your head. But I know that listeners and myself will be very interested in this. It's just the mechanics of how you're actually harvesting the animals. As hunters, I think we're going to be curious to this because you have to be at a certain level of proficiency that I think all of us as hunters would probably want to be. So do you mind telling me, Jake, like what the exact equipment you guys use, like the caliber of your rifle, the rests you guys use, any of that stuff? Do you mind just nerding out on that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. We have, and it's one of the other things that like it has evolved a lot over the years, but we can't leave the road. So that the harvesting or like the rendering process starts with a forward-looking infrared binocular unit that our spotter is using that feeds into a video screen that the USDA official is viewing.
Okay.
And so imagine like coming up over a hill in your UTV, we use Yamaha Vikings. Coming up over the hill, like everything's black and there's a group of deer at 105 yards. And this binocular is so good that at 7 miles, I could tell you the difference between a goat and a deer.
I got you.
So at 105 yards, you can see like every hair, you can see abscesses. And because it's heat based, like, if they're pregnant, like, everything about this animal. It follows kind of step one in that giant rule book of, is that animal healthy?
Yeah, I got you.
Shooting starts there. And the shooter so we're using either, and it's not actually our preferred round. We're using 308 or 22 mag, and we don't have suppressors. Aren't legally, like, we can't use suppressors here in Hawaii, which would be a huge, so it makes it pretty tough. But
sure.
The reason we're using 308 and 22 mag is because it's the only ammunition we can buy in bulk.
Yeah, sure.
So I'd love to be using like a 22-250 or something that shoots flatter because it's hard to get ranges at night.
Yeah.
But we use 308 and 22 mag anytime, like we're basically inside 50 yards, we'll use a 22 mag. Anything outside of 50 yards, we'll use a 308. And that next step, all of our shooters are using the best FLIR equipment we can get on, like as FLIR scopes. And the reason being is the more pixelated a head gets out past 100 yards, it like really starts to affect your aim point. And here's how we're able to render at the same efficiency as we do in a plant is we train all of our guys, which like it takes us a certain type of person to do this. It takes like a certain type of mentality. We train all of them to have to miss 30% of the time. And so I'll explain that is basically all of our guys that want to be a shooter for us have to be able to shoot a 1-inch group at 200 yards. So like they start there. And then like they need to understand deer behavior. Like it takes them a year plus to understand deer behavior, like as a spotter or as a driver, like watching those videos, seeing how they move their head, like seeing when they're going to stop. Like you really have to understand like every single one of their movements. And then what we do is if you think of like your typical bullseye, we make them basically bump up their aim point 30%. So you're aiming high, right? Because if we miss high and that animal walks away, nothing bad happens. Like
right.
You get fined by the USDA, nothing there happens. But the minute that bullet, because we have to break the skull cap. So in order for it to be rendered immediately unconscious, you have to break the skull cap. And think of that skull cap as like the size of an orange.
Yeah.
And what takes like a really interesting perspective, like for your shooter is a perfect shot is as good as a perfect miss.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is we keep data on every single bullet, every single shot, all of these different things. And if they start shooting better than 70% in a night, they actually will get in trouble, because what's end up happening is their aim point is dropping down further into the head. And when you can get in trouble is if you miss that skull cap and hit like anywhere in the face or neck or anything else, right? So it takes a really interesting type of person to be able to shoot constantly all night long and be perfectly okay with like a perfect miss and then like a perfect shot following it. Because most people, when you miss something and you know you miss high, what are you going to do? Like your brain starts to gradually pull that aim point down, and like it happens like intuitively. You don't even think about it.
Yeah, sure. So, they're doing it without even knowing it. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, it just takes like a really disciplined person to be able to like shoot for our teams, because the perfect night for them is them going back and looking at like the 70 rounds they put down like downrange and knowing like 30% of them were perfect misses, and like they're aiming for like they know at 200 yards at a 1-inch group, they're gonna miss 30% of the time if their aim point is basically on like the tip of that skull cap. Right?
Yeah, so you're basically taking that rifle grouping and you're setting it where 30% of it clears the animal's forehead.
Yeah, and it just ensures that nothing like drops down several inches and like gets us into trouble.
Yeah, and given that it's a hunting podcast, I think there's probably some value in us going into that a little bit, Jake. And and tell me if what I've always done, as I've guided over the years, I've had people that usually it's like a follow-up shot or something like that. They ask me, do you want me to shoot them in the head? And I always say no. And the reason is because over the years I've dealt with deer and elk that have been hit in the face. Yep. And I don't think people understand that like what you're doing. It takes a system like you're talking about, because that vital section is small part of the head. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. The nasal cavity and all of that is not. It's really can make the situation not fun. So it's really intriguing, the system you've developed to deal with that. Just like that you guys have obviously thought about that, and that to be proficient there, it's not easy. I think everybody would view it as like, well, of course you just shoot them in the head. And it's like, well, yeah, well.
Like one of the hardest things is it's all happening at night through forward-looking infrared, and that is like you're still dealing with a digital image. So as you zoom in, especially like when there's velvet. So when there's velvet and there's heat coming off of that velvet,
okay.
It starts to form like a misshapen head.
Okay.
Actually sometimes don't know exactly like where the head is. So yeah, it is definitely a skill. So like when a new shooter starts with us, like they've gone through all the training, everything else, like they start at 50%. Like we want them missing half of the animals. And then like if they can, if they're disciplined enough to shoot 50%, we move them to 60%, and then we'll move them down to 70%. But it's just like a really interesting discipline that comes with, there's still a live animal moving around, like nodding its head, figuring out what to do, feeding, all of these different things. So like all of our rests and the bags and everything you use to try and make everything stable. Ultimately, those UTV platforms are the best because you can like pivot them and move them around to get kind of the perfect angle on each one of these shots.
Right.
But yeah, the whole system is been iterated over.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, and that's the thing, man. It's a 1-inch group at 200 yards on a live animal. That's hard.
Yeah.
I
think we're going on like 30,000 deer now. So
yeah, you get some practice. No, I totally get it. And I didn't mean to dive crazy deep in that. I just
it's a great question.
It's very interesting to people, and when you fathom what's really going on there, it's pretty involved. Let's jump back to the New Zealand deal, Jake. So a lot of what you've talked about is you guys have developed kind of some of your own technology. Like the first thing, when you talk about all the thermal stuff, immediately what comes in my mind is, why are these state game managers why aren't they do that instead of, counts out of a helicopter? Just a bunch of questions I have in that regard. But before we talk about that, did you kind of take anything that was going on in New Zealand and apply it to your business? Did you use it as a plate, I guess, a resource?
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually my last year of college. I wrote a business plan based on the New Zealand model of like domestication or habituation. And I had no idea that it was completely wrong. Like, you can't domesticate axis deer. A bunch of people have tried. You'd think, like, with as good as it tastes and it being able to breed year round, there'd be like domesticated axis deer everywhere across the world. But you just can't. They're such a fickle animal. But what was really interesting is the New Zealand developed this like incredible deer industry basically from the 50s through 70s and 80s with like wild harvesting basically out of helicopters. So they don't have to meet they have different rules and regulations. So they don't have to meet the first step of being like the inspector being able to view the animal and see the whole process. They can shoot an animal and bring it into the facility, and then the USDA or their USDA can say like, yeah, that animal's healthy. So what's really interesting, what happened in New Zealand was they built this entire deer industry basically like culling deer out of helicopters, which is amazing. I think it ended up being like 7% of their GDP at its height. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, we can't find any more deer.
Yeah.
And so they pivoted to like then live capture and domestication and habituation. And like now we have these like huge deer farms in New Zealand. And what was really interesting was we always took that into account because the expense now, guess what? All of those deer are not meant to be even in these like giant stations. Now they have antibiotics, and now they have diseases, and now they have like all these different things that they didn't have in the wild. And it was all because they couldn't collect that survey data. So if New Zealand would have had the tools that we have today, they'd have, I guarantee they're extremely smart, like forward-looking conservationists there. Like,
yeah, they wouldn't have shot them out to the extent.
Yeah, they'd have started surveying, saying like, wait, if we try and domesticate these things, it's going to cost us a whole bunch more money. Like, let's just keep them wild, but let's keep sustainable numbers at this. And just looking at the, like what they have to go through every single day now to like produce venison for their communities from these domesticated like red stag and everything else, it's 10 times the effort of like shooting something in the wild. So we've learned a lot from, I think, a lot of the mistakes that they had, but also they didn't have like the technology and the data available to like keep this animal wild.
Yeah. And that hits on another question I have, Jake. And this is just my opinion. I don't want it to reflect that it has your opinion at all, Jake. But my opinion is that in general, in the western states of the U.S., the data that's collected out of helicopters and counts is really poor. I from my experience with it, it's very, very poor. Year to year. It's just it's for a whole bunch of reasons. How much it costs, the technology, all of that. So I think that we probably always overweight the value of that. I really do. That's my personal opinion. I think we underrate the value of people's opinion that are just in the field, be it, just people enjoying wildlife, hunters, guides, outfitters, local wardens or whatever who are out in the field. That always gets discounted to like count data.
Yeah.
I think my personal view is that that's a big problem with the management of Western big game populations. Why are they still doing that, and why aren't they doing what you're doing? not to like put you on the spot. I'm just
it's a really good question because it applies here in Hawaii, because we do what we do on private land, and our state employees, which operate like very, very similar to the way you would in Montana or something else with Fish and Wildlife. They do it the old school way, and we've asked them the same question. And so where they're using scat plots or distance sampling or all these different like methods that have been used for 50, 60 years, we can come along. Like a great example is we did a survey of 160,000 acres about a year ago. And that is an exact count. It's a minimum of a certain number of deer to within about 95% accuracy using that like survey, that FLIR technology. The state did what you guys would know as a typical like count survey out of a helicopter. They're looking at a helicopter, and then they use something called distance sampling, which calculates the distance from the helicopter, the relative angle, and then they basically use math to extrapolate the total number. They got 10,000, we got 60,000.
Yeah.
And that can work the complete opposite direction too. Like if they happen to fly over the line that has more deer, that math, like they could have flown the wrong line, and that could have been, they could have got 100,000 and we could have got 60,000. Yeah. So I don't have the answer. I know it's cost prohibitive, but I also just know, our government agencies are giant boats that take a really, really long time to turn, because if there's all this historical data used with a particular methodology and they're trying to make decisions like based on the difference year to year. Yeah. I remember like sitting on a slope in Colorado and thinking like, if I had that binocular unit, like I could tell you every animal that's in this basin, like in like this 40,000 acres.
Yeah.
And I just think, yeah, it'll get there. I think there'll be enough pressure for great data along the way, especially when like poor decisions with bad data are being made.
Yeah. And I think you hit on it a little bit there, Jake. And I have this conversation a lot, so I don't want to just crap on, state game departments, but what I found is the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be an acknowledgement amongst the hunting community and the management community of wildlife that the data is not that good. Yeah. That's my view on it. As I think there's this clinging on to it that, it's pretty accurate. No, it's not. I mean, there's units in Colorado, Jake, that I've counted more mountain goats in one day than they claim the whole population is, or in vice versa. Yeah. You know what I mean? I think there first needs to be this acknowledgement that it probably could have some improvement. And it sounds like you're an example of that, and you hit on other stuff too, just the dynamic of, counting one section and then extrapolating it to, total population and total population dynamics it's really messy,
Well, for us, it was like, we started as like the recreational hunter and certainly still am, but like every single day I feel accountable to our communities for resource availability.
Sure.
And holy shit, I'm not doing that unless I have good data. Like
Yeah, I mean, if the rancher wants 6,000 deer, you don't want to knock it back down to 1,500 on accident.
Exactly. So like I would never do the work we're doing without that tool. I would just never feel comfortable doing it. So yeah, hopefully we see some improvement both within like Hawaii, but like also would love to see that technology and methodology used across the Western states for sure.
Yeah, no, I hear you. We'll just change subjects here, Jake, because I got a couple more. Are you good on time, man?
Yep, I'm good.
Got another like 15, 20 minutes because I got some that are very interesting to me. And actually it's follow on of a couple of interviews of you that I listened to, but there's always this, it's kind of common knowledge amongst livestock people or hunters that how animals are harvested affects, the texture of the meat and, how it tastes and a lot of these different things, the pH level. And I'll be honest with you and the listener. I always thought this was like partial myth to be honest with you. I didn't even know that it was totally true. So I dug into a bunch of academic literature and it's actually fairly well studied. And so it was eye opening to me like, oh yeah, this is a thing. And comment on it in the context that you've been a recreational hunter and you're now harvesting these animals the way that we've already discussed within your business. Do you notice a difference, Jake? like in those factors of the meat, in like even how it tastes or how it looks? Let me know what you think on that.
Yeah. So we now know it like to be 100% true. So we actually have a study coming out here in about a month and a half that measured the oxidative stress of a bunch of our animals that we harvested compared to 120 ranches across North America for cattle.
Okay.
It measures phytochemical and all the different things, and like all of the oxidative stress that comes along with like stress while harvesting and how that affects like meat quality. And it varied a bunch through the cattle, but basically ours was like zero because that animal is essentially under no stress, because if it starts walking, it moves away. But you know what's interesting is I don't notice it as much as my wife does. So
in the actual meat.
So she does the vast majority of the cooking, and like when I go out and I now bow hunt something and bringing home, she's like, "You can eat that," because the animal that comes home through our commercial harvesting, A, it's a lot cleaner, but B, specifically texture and color, not necessarily taste sometimes, but like texture and color can be completely different.
Yeah.
And we eat venison and salmon, like that's all we eat. And so it's like she can really notice the difference when I try and like put something on the plate that's different. But anecdotally, through a whole bunch of work that we've done, we also, I'll give you a great example. We did a project that was a 400-acre area that was fenced, and we were looking to remove the last amount of those deer. And the deer in there understood that they were in a pen, like they had been in there for like several months. They're figuring out, like they were constantly trying to figure out how to get out. We were still rendering them all in the head, like we were still shooting them all in the head.
Yeah.
But rigor mortis, which is the process of basically all of your glycogen stores in your muscle moving, and like, or lactic acids to glycogen and like vice versa, that entirely depends on how stressed you are prior to dying. And that's what creates rigor mortis. That's what like helps, basically what you feel as a hunter is how stiff they get, how quickly.
Sure.
So those animals that we harvested under, like they were stressed in that situation, and they were mentally stressed. They didn't actually know we were there. Went into rigor mortis like 3 times as fast as our commercially harvested animals. So that's the best gauge of how stressed they are, is how fast they move into rigor mortis, because they've burned all of those sugar stores, which typically like convert to lactic acids and starts like the slow breakdown of your body when you die. And those animals were stiff in minutes compared to a commercially harvested animal that like is under no stress. It's never penned. It's never baited. Like those animals take hours.
Yeah.
And that changes like coloration and texture. Like they get paler, and they get like that meat, like that muscle meat is stiffer, even though they're still being shot in the head. So when you think of like a hunter, and even some of the best shots, that animal still takes 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 50, like
oh yeah. That's
and or worse, right?
Yeah, sure.
So it absolutely affects texture and taste. But for somebody that doesn't know the difference, or like doesn't have like that constant comparison, it'd be pretty, an elk that died in 3 minutes versus 30 seconds still tastes amazing, right?
Yeah, it's hard to, yeah, they're not going to have the data set to see such a difference like you are.
Yeah, but we definitely, it's crazy. We definitely see it and can taste it here just because of how often we do it.
Yeah. It makes for a unique product, right? I mean, even an an Axis deer hunter can't necessarily replicate exactly what you guys are providing. And it's interesting. I mean, the whole thing's interesting. I mean, we've hit on a lot of that stuff, Jake. Like, as hunters, it's not. There's still differences, right? How clean it is. How the animal was harvested. There's a bunch of stuff that honestly, if you would have asked me 5-6 years ago, I would have been like, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? But there is a difference. And this one in particular, I'm sure it's because there's so much economics around the efficiency of just feeding this world, there's actually a lot of research on exactly what you said. Just them trying to be more efficient, and more effective at killing animals in these slaughterhouses and stuff to minimize that change. But it's the way you said about it being where they're pinned up. You're basically saying that their life, like in a way, their lifestyle in the previous X amount of time, it also matters. It's not just how they're killed. Is that basically what you're getting at there?
Yeah, and we do very few projects where any animal's penned. Like all of the commercial harvesting we do, none of them are penned and everything else. And that's why we get such great meat quality out of it. But we purposely, and I think it probably started because we were hunters, we've purposely developed all of the systems to keep them wild and never pen them and never bait them, because we know it originally started as it felt like the right thing to do, and now we know it produces a much better product, which wasn't ever really the plan. It was just, it felt like the right thing to do originally, right?
Yeah, sure. Well, and like you said earlier, you have the tools to be able to do it that way.
Yeah.
I have a life, I grew up from a cattle ranching family and stuff. So in my mind, at first, when somebody shows me your business model, I'm like, well, why wouldn't you just pin them up and breed them domestically, have an efficient process at doing it? And you've brought up a lot of reasons why that doesn't make sense. I have a totally random question for you, Jake, and you hit on it here, and I heard you talk about it in a previous podcast. You talk about when you were younger, you moved to eating a lot of axis deer for a period of time. And it's really just a personal question, because I eat a lot of game meat, but I also eat a lot of red meat. And I have found that for me personally, I can't only eat lean game meat, or I actually get a drop in energy, pretty significant. Jake, did you ever notice that? Or do you have any insight on that? What I've found works for me is to eat a fair amount of red meat that has way higher fat content. Do you have any thoughts on that, man?
Yeah. So I kind of I landed at a similar place. That's why we do salmon.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's those DHAs and omega-3s that you're not getting in such a lean animal. Even though we now know, again, part of that study, which was pretty crazy, is our omega-3s and 6, our omega-6, 3s, 9s, a lot of those primary amino acids are 4 times higher in axis deer than they are in beef, which seems counterintuitive because they're so lean. Yeah. But the intramuscular fat that they do have is just super high in those critical fats, I think, with the way they're eating. But I still don't think it's enough. We do either local fish here that I spearfish, or salmon, because it's just not quite enough. But when you have you've eaten nothing but deer for 2 or 3 months, and then you have a real steak from a great cow your buddy gives you, there's nothing quite like it for sure. But we are I think adding salmon in really helps with a lot of the fat levels that you're probably not getting with primarily game. But we do know, and we can circle back to this in the months to come, but we do now know with some of this data that's going to come out that wild game, as a function of phytochemicals, all of the macros, even the fats, are significantly healthier for you than grain or grass-fed cattle, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure it is. I mean, it makes sense given all that we've talked about, but it's very intriguing. And that kind of leads me to the next question, Jake. I mean, I love the concept. Everybody should check out your website, and I'll give you a chance here at the end to pit where they can find you. What's do you see this as something going beyond axis deer eventually, or where's your end state on the business? Have you thought about that?
This is really a place-based solution. So sure. The end state for us is really to make sure we're collectively utilizing this resource for what's best for community here locally. But what we've built, which is really interesting, is like mobile harvesting systems. And so like there's invasive ungulates, mammals like across the planet in all these different places that same thing are like completely unmanaged or mismanaged. And like, I don't know if it ever gets bigger than that. Like we are going to do, we were only doing 3,000 or 4,000 deer last year, and we're going to do 15 to 20,000 deer like next year. And so I'm sure we're going to like figure out at scale what breaks and what works and what doesn't work.
Sure.
But I think, I think we've hit on it a bunch of times in this conversation, but having that baseline data that says like, what is balance, what's sustainable, what works for community, farmers, ranchers, ecosystems, reefs, like that whole system, it can be replicated in different places for sure. Like much better data can only serve our communities better across the board and like make better decisions. So like that comes along with the harvesting system. So I think to answer your question, the end game is for sure just to take care of this place first. And then once we see it operating at scale, like Japan has 5 million invasive deer.
Yeah.
Like sure. What else does that look like? What else does like having really great data? I have to assume, I don't know, like human nature is interesting, but like market hunting has had such a negative impact throughout North America, over the last 100 years. And like similarly, like we talked about in New Zealand, like would they made those same decisions if they had great data every single day? Like, would they have kept shooting all of those buffalo if they knew that like that was going to be like, it just makes me wonder, like, I still have a lot of, hope in humanity that they make great decisions.
Yeah. No, I think you nailed it, man. I mean, one, on your business front, to me, this is just my brain like cranking in the background. I'm like, well, maybe what Jake's really built is, a system and technology business, and he doesn't really know it. He's just perfecting that, and he's going to apply to all sorts of different things on this planet. But you bring up the market hunting deal, and I'd love to get your insight on it. I actually think that, particularly as North American hunters, we look at that, and we look at all the regulations around that is very important. There's really a negative context around market hunting for good reason. But I wonder, Jake, if history has not been distorted around what actually happened a little bit. I in a way, let's take the buffalo thing. Really, what happened was it that there were these, a bunch of drunk cowboys out there just shooting everything until it was gone, or was it just a strategic mistake? That some financial interest and some overexcitement about it. People got ahead of themselves, and then you couldn't turn the clock back, right?
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that is actually going on, and that gets to your point about if they had the information, like, hey, we're beyond these things being able to recover in some reasonable amount of time. Like, let's stop shooting them. I wonder what really would have happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and I think we never quite have the answers to some of that. And again, like the negative connotations of market hunting come back to the conversation of resource availability, and that resource always being available to the public, right? That's the conflicting conversation there, is like market hunting is going to limit the resource availability for hunters. And I think that's always been a function of like data in the long run. But as a great example, market hunting has persisted in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Right.
Like all of the stations and all of these places throughout like Ireland and all these different places, like there's always been market hunting in those places. And I think there's lots of great like information to pull on. Some places have done it really well, some places haven't. But again, it's just like keeps coming back to data. Like I would never tackle this thing without that data. Because just the daily uncertainty would probably kill me.
No, I hear you. But it's in the end, it's still a real interesting topic.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know more about it, Jake. So let me know if I say anything that's incorrect. And I think a lot of the listeners probably understand this, but there's not, I mean, if you eat elk at a restaurant or wild boar at a restaurant, it's not actually, though, it's not wild animals, right?
No.
And I actually kind of find it stunning that menus can represent it that way. It's almost like false advertisement.
Yeah.
But you hear people say that all the time. They're like, "Oh, I've tried elk. I tried it at X restaurant." It's like, well, you didn't try elk, and so I think a lot of the listeners on this podcast will understand that, but some that might be new information too. But I think it's important because that there's negative consequences to that regulation too, from what I understand. It's hard. I mean, there's a lot of people who really enjoy hunting. I'm sure it's the same way in Hawaii, and they just end up with too much meat. It's not going to stop them from hunting because they enjoy hunting. It's how they spend time with their family, how they spend their disposable income. It's awesome, but it's difficult to get rid of, or not get rid of. It's difficult to efficiently get that meat to somebody that could use it because of some of these laws. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some states have done, and I don't know enough about this to speak as an expert, but some states have done a really good job with some of those Hunters for Hungry program, where you can go in, turn in a carcass, it moved through a state inspected facility so it can be checked and everything else, and then like move to the community as like donations for food. But that's like slaughter and processing facilities are getting few and far between. Like every year one dies here in Hawaii, and I'm sure that's happening across, like North America as well too. So yeah, it's really hard to get it's getting harder to share.
Sure.
Because it used to be, I'm guessing, really easy, where you would go down the street and everybody on your street, if you took them like some great cuts of venison in your classic like brown paper, would be like, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But you walk 3 houses down your street now, like you have no idea what the response is going to be when you knock on the door and be like, "Hey, do you want some venison?" Like it's
No, I totally agree, and I, in some ways, man, and this is like a conversation way out of the realm of, I guess, hunting, but I think I hope, and it seems to be the case, that COVID's kind of changed this a little bit, at least the momentum of it a little bit. I know like the cattle industry and other livestock industries in the U.S. have gotten a little, the public has gotten an eye opener of like, look, all this stuff's getting processed in like 2 facilities or 4, and people are like, this is a real big problem. It's like, well, the regulatory environment's what created that, So will that change? Is the momentum? I mean, I'm kind of hopeful it does, man. I think even beyond this, the hunting realm that we're talking about, I mean, there's tons of opportunity for us with modern technology to have smaller ways of distributing meat or whatever kind of food. So
and we have lots of like great. I think what's interesting about what we do is just it's a resource that we have lots of people that write us in and say, "Oh, now I'm going to try hunting." So they wanted to start, like they were interested in it as a food resource. And then they got a box and they tried it and they're like, "Wow, this is amazing." We get lots of messages that say like, "Where do I start as a hunter?" So it's interesting that it's serving as like food and hopefully a gateway to like them maybe becoming a hunter and understanding like the total value of being in these wild places and like getting to go on all these amazing adventures. And we certainly hope like that introduction can help our hunting community as well in the future.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I could see how that occurs. And while we're on that, Jake, let people know how they can, look you up, follow you, if they want to buy some Axis deer meat, give them the rundown on that.
Yeah. So it's everything, the vast majority of it is based out of our website. So MauiNuiVenison.com. We do social media, but not well. That's we're not huge fans, but we're on Instagram at Maui Nui Venison. And yeah, we base a lot of great information off the site. There's videos there. There's like survey results are on there. Like a lot of we share almost everything that we collect. So it all lives on that website. So if you dig into that website past kind of the pages where you can buy something, there's lots of great info for somebody that's interested.
Sweet, man. Well, cool. I really appreciate your time, Jake. I know I'm stretching it here. We're gonna get into an hour and a half, but thanks, man. It was awesome. I got like 1,000 more questions in the back of my head, man. But I'm gonna let you go. The main takeaway I think listeners should think about is, one, there's tons of knowledge in here about just axis deer in general, but what you're offering is unique, man. It's really like the only, as far as I know, it's one of the very, very few sources of wild game meat that you can't, that doesn't involve you having to do it as a hunter. So that's pretty cool, man. I'm glad that you found a way to like break that mold and have that an option for people. So thanks for coming on.
I appreciate it, Cliff. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Jake. All right, folks. Thanks for listening. I had a great time interviewing Jake. If you want to keep in touch with me, you can follow me on my YouTube channel. You can just search for Cliff Gray on YouTube. It'll pop up. You can also sign up for my newsletter at pursuitwithcliff.com or follow me on Instagram at Cliff, Gry, CLIFFGRY. Thanks, guys.